The knock on my door came at midnight, and I knew before I opened it that my life was about to change. My name is Clara Whitfield, and 3 hours earlier, a man in a gray suit had told me my bakery would be seized within the week. The oven had been in my family for 30 years. My mother had died, proving that bread made with love tastes different from bread made with money. Now the bank wanted both the oven and the building, and I had neither the love nor the money to stop them. So when I opened my door and saw Damien Voss standing under the streetlight, I did not scream. I did not run. I simply stared at the most dangerous man in the city and waited to hear what he wanted from me. He did not smile. He rarely did. His dark coat made him look taller than he already was, and his eyes moved past me into my small apartment as if he were counting the exits. "I have a proposal," he said, "one that solves your problem and mine at the same time." I laughed, though nothing was funny. "Men like you do not need bakers, Mr. Voss." He stepped inside without being invited, which told me everything about how our conversation would go. "I need a wife," he said. "Not forever, 6 months. My father is dying, and his last wish is to see me settled before he closes his eyes. The families who circle my business like vultures will not move against a married man with a family, at least not until the morning ends." I crossed my arms. "And you chose me because you owe the bank $40,000, and I can make that debt disappear before sunrise," he said. "Because you have no family left to put in danger. Because you are, from what I am told, a woman who does not frighten easily." I frightened plenty. I was simply better than most at hiding it. "I need time to think," I told him, though we both knew there was nothing to think about. A woman drowning does not ask the rope if it has ever pulled anyone else out of water. He placed a card on my counter, beside the bag of flour I had been too anxious to put away. "Midnight tomorrow. If you are not there, I will assume you found another way to save your bakery." We both knew I had not. That night, I did not sleep. I walked through the small shop below my apartment, touching the counters my mother had wiped down every morning for 2 decades, the chalkboard where she used to write the daily special in careful handwriting. I thought about the neighborhood women who came in every Sunday for cinnamon bread, about the children who pressed their faces to the glass to look at the cakes. If I lost this place, I lost the only thing that still connected me to her. I remembered the winter my mother lost her first oven to a fire caused by a faulty wire, and how she had cried for exactly 1 night before rolling up her sleeves and starting over with borrowed pans and secondhand flour. She used to say that a bakery was not 4 walls and an oven, but a promise you made to the people who walked through the door hungry, and walked out feeling like someone cared whether they ate well that day. I could still hear her voice telling me that promises were worth more than money, right before she would hand me a warm loaf to give to whichever neighbor looked like they needed it most that week. I thought of Mrs. Ellery down the street, who came in every Tuesday for a single roll because that was all her pension allowed, and how I always slipped an extra pastry into her bag without charging her for it. I thought of the teenagers who studied at my corner table until closing, because their own homes were too loud for schoolwork. If the bank took my bakery, it would not just take a building. It would take away the one steady thing an entire block of tired, ordinary people had learned to depend on. By morning, my decision had already made itself. I found the address on the card, an office tower downtown with glass doors that opened before I even reached them, as if the building itself had been warned of my arrival. A young man escorted me to the top floor, where Damien sat behind a desk with no papers on it, only a single phone that never seemed to stop lighting up. "I will do it," I said, "but I want the rules first." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit, Miss Whitfield." "No feelings," he said, "once I had. No questions about my business, ever, regardless of what you see or hear. You will live in my home, attend events at my side, and convince my father that this marriage is real. When the 6 months end, your debts vanish, and you walk away with enough money to expand that bakery of yours into something bigger than a corner shop. And if I say no to any of that," I asked. "Then you say no to all of it," he said simply. "There is no version of this arrangement where you choose the parts that suit you and leave the rest. My world does not work in halves." I folded my hands in my lap so he would not see them shaking. "What happens to me when the 6 months end, and your father is gone, and the families have already seen your wife's face at every dinner and every funeral? Do I simply disappear? You disappear with money, a stronger business, and no debt hanging over your head, he said. What you do after that is entirely your own decision. I will not follow you, and I will not ask anything more of you once the arrangement is finished. And if something happens to me while I am playing this part, I asked, if one of your rivals decides I am worth threatening, then I protect you, he said, without hesitation, as though the answer required no thought at all. That much I promise you, regardless of what else in this arrangement is fake. I studied him for a long moment, searching for the lie in his face and finding none. I studied him for a long moment. There was something behind his composure, something guarded so tightly that I wondered if even he remembered what it was protecting. Fine, I said, but I keep my bakery. I run it every morning, no matter what your world requires of me at night. For the first time, something close to respect crossed his face. Agreed. We were married 11 days later, in a small private ceremony attended by people whose names I never learned, men in dark suits who watched the doors more than they watched the bride. My own hands trembled as I said the words a stranger had written for me to memorize. Damien's hands did not tremble at all, though when the officiant told him to kiss his bride, I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, gone before anyone else could notice it. Afterward, a black car took us away from the small chapel, and I watched the city blur past the window, wondering what exactly I had agreed to become. You did well, Damien said, breaking the silence between us. I did what I had to, I answered. That is different from doing well. He turned to look at me properly, perhaps for the first time since we had met. You are not what I expected, Miss Whitfield. Mrs. Voss now, I reminded him, and something almost like amusement touched the corner of his mouth. The car slowed as we approached a gate, tall and iron, guarded by two men who nodded once and let us through without a word. Beyond it stood a house larger than any building I had ever set foot inside, its windows glowing gold against the darkening sky. Welcome home, Damien said, though the word home felt strange coming from a man who lived behind locked gates and silent guards. I stepped out of the car and looked up at the house that was now supposed to be mine, at least for the next 6 months, and felt the full weight of what I had done settle onto my shoulders. I had walked willingly into the world of a man everyone feared, carrying nothing but my mother's recipes and a debt that no longer belonged to me. Somewhere behind those glowing windows, an old man was waiting to meet the woman his son claimed to love. And somewhere in the city, people were already asking questions about the wedding no one had been warned about. I did not know yet how dangerous those questions would become, or how much of my heart I would lose to a man who had only ever asked to borrow my hand. But standing there, beneath that enormous house, I understood one thing clearly. There was no going back to the woman I had been the night before. Whatever came next, I would have to face it as Clara Voss. Damien led me through the front doors, and the first face I saw was his sister's, arms crossed, eyes sharp with suspicion, already waiting to catch me in a lie. Well, she said, looking me over from head to toe. So this is the woman who fixed everything. I straightened my shoulders and held her gaze without flinching, because I had already learned that in this house, weakness was the one thing I could not afford to show. She circled me slowly, the way someone might inspect a piece of furniture, before deciding whether it belonged in the room. My name is Vivian, she said. My brother does not fall in love. He calculates. So whatever arrangement the two of you have made, I suggest you remember your place in it. I have no intention of forgetting, I said evenly. I am here to bake bread and play a part, not to steal anything that belongs to you. Vivian's eyes narrowed, as though she had expected an argument and did not quite know what to do without one. See that you keep it that way, she said, then turned on her heel and walked toward the staircase without another word. Damien watched her go, then looked at me with something unreadable behind his expression. She will come around, he said, though he did not sound entirely convinced of it himself. I do not need her to like me, I answered. I only need her to believe I am your wife. That, he said quietly, may prove to be the harder task. Let us see about that, I said, and turned to follow Vivian deeper into the house, into a life I had agreed to for 6 months, and would soon discover I could not simply walk away from when the time came. A scream from the courtyard tore me out of sleep before dawn, and I was on my feet and halfway to the window before I remembered where I was. 3 men stood below in the gray morning light, and one of them was on his knees while the other 2 spoke to him in voices too low for me to hear. I could not make out words, only the shape of fear on the kneeling man's face, and I stepped back from the glass before anyone looked up and saw me watching. By the time I dressed and came downstairs, the courtyard was empty, as though nothing had happened there at all. Damien sat at the long dining table with a cup of coffee he had not touched, reading something on his phone with the same unreadable expression he wore for everything. "Good morning," I said carefully. He looked up, and for a moment something flickered across his face, an instinct to protect me from a question I had not yet asked. "That was business," he said. "It does not concern you." "It concerned me enough to wake me up," I answered, sitting across from him. "I am not asking what happened. I am only telling you that pretending I saw nothing is going to be difficult if it happens again outside my window." He was quiet for a moment. "I will have you moved to a room facing the garden instead," he said finally. "That is the only accommodation I can offer." It was not an apology, but it was something close to one, and I found myself grateful for it despite everything. The first weeks in that house taught me a new language, one made of silences and careful glances rather than words. The staff moved like shadows, never speaking unless spoken to. The guards at the gate rotated in shifts I never quite learned to predict, and Vivian watched me from doorways, waiting for the moment I would slip and reveal myself as the fraud she already believed me to be. It was Damien's father who broke through that silence first. I met Elias Voss on my 5th morning in that house, in a sunroom filled with plants that someone clearly tended with great care. He sat in a wheelchair near the window, a blanket over his knees despite the warm light, and when he saw me, he smiled in a way his son never quite managed. "So you are the woman who finally caught my son," he said, gesturing for me to sit beside him. "Come, tell me everything he refuses to tell me himself." I sat, unsure how much of the truth I was allowed to give him. "We met through mutual circumstances," I said carefully. "He needed someone steady, and I needed a fresh start. It grew from there." Elias studied me with eyes that reminded me painfully of my own late mother's, sharp despite the frailty of the body around them. "That is a very practical answer for a woman who is supposed to be in love," he said, and my stomach dropped. "I am not usually one for grand declarations," I said quickly, recovering. "I show love through actions, not speeches. Ask your son what I have been baking for him every morning since I arrived." That, at least, was true. Every morning since my arrival, I had risen early to bake something small, a habit I could not shake even in a house with a private chef standing ready to serve any meal I wanted. It was the one part of myself I refused to abandon inside these walls. Elias laughed, a real laugh that seemed to cost him effort. "Bring me something tomorrow," he said. "Let me judge the truth of this marriage with my own tongue." I promised I would, and something in his eyes told me I had passed whatever test he had quietly been running since I sat down. Walking back through the hallway, I found Damien waiting near the staircase, arms crossed, clearly having heard at least part of the conversation from wherever he had been standing. "You did not have to charm him," he said, though there was no accusation in his voice. "I was not trying to charm anyone," I answered. He asked a question, and I answered honestly, which is more than I can say for most conversations in this house. Something shifted in his expression, and for the first time since the wedding, he looked at me not as an arrangement, but as a person standing in front of him. "Thank you," he said quietly. He has not laughed like that in months. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and we stood there in a silence that felt different from the ones before it. The next morning, I brought Elias a small almond cake, still warm from the oven, and watched his face soften with the first bite, in a way that reminded me achingly of home. From that day forward, our mornings in the sunroom became a ritual neither of us spoke about, but both of us protected fiercely. He asked about my mother, about the bakery, about the childhood that had shaped my hands into ones that could coax comfort out of butter and flour. I found myself telling him things I had not told anyone in years, grateful for an audience who wanted nothing from me except honesty. Vivian noticed, of course. She noticed everything. "He likes you," she said one evening, cornering me in the kitchen while I cleaned flour from the counter. That complicates things. I am not trying to complicate anything, I said. I am trying to survive 6 months without breaking your father's heart along the way. And what happens when the 6 months end, and he asks why his son's wife suddenly vanished, she said, her voice sharper than usual. Have you thought about that, or does that not concern you either? The question hit somewhere I had been avoiding looking. I have thought about it, I admitted. I do not have an answer yet. At least you are honest about that much, she said. And for the first time since I had arrived, she did not sound entirely hostile when she said it. 2 days after Vivian's warning, a courier delivered a thick cream envelope addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Voss, and I watched Damien's jaw tighten the moment he read the card inside. What is it? I asked. An invitation, he said, setting it down carefully, as though it might bite him. The Marchetti family is hosting a dinner. They have not invited me anywhere in over a year, which means they want to see for themselves whether the rumors about my marriage are true. Rumors? I repeated. That you married a stranger too quickly for it to be genuine, he said. That I am weak, distracted, perhaps even afraid, and using a wife as a shield. Men like Callum Marchetti do not send invitations out of kindness. They send them to test what they suspect. My stomach tightened at the mention of a name I had never heard before, spoken with a weight that told me exactly how dangerous the man behind it must be. And if we fail this test, I asked, then everything I have built becomes a target, he said simply. Everyone who works for me, everyone who depends on this family staying strong, becomes vulnerable the moment the wrong people believe I have grown soft. I sat with that for a long moment, the full scale of what I had agreed to finally settling into focus. This was never only about comforting a dying man, I realized. It was armor, and I had agreed to wear it without fully understanding how heavy it would be. We will need to prepare you, Damien said, watching my face carefully. How I take my coffee, the names of people who matter to this family, small details a real wife would know without thinking. It is not enough to look married. You must think like someone who has shared a life with me. Over the following days, our mornings in the sunroom with Elias became stranger, layered now, with a second purpose beneath the first. Between bites of cake, Elias would casually mention a story from Damien's childhood, and I would store it away like a coin, aware that Damien was listening closely from the doorway, aware that every detail might one day save us both at a dinner table, surrounded by men who wanted us to fail. Vivian, surprisingly, became part of this preparation too. She drilled me on names over dinner, testing me sharply and correcting my mistakes without gentleness. But I noticed she no longer looked at me the way she had the night I arrived. You learn quickly, she admitted one evening, when I finally recited an entire guest list without a single error. I suppose that counts for something. It counts for surviving, I said. That is all I am trying to do. She studied me for a moment longer than usual. My brother has had many women pass through his life, she said quietly. None of them ever bothered learning anything about him, beyond what his money could offer them. You are the first who seems to be paying attention to the actual person underneath all of this. I did not know how to answer that, so I simply nodded, and she left the kitchen without another word, leaving me with a strange warmth I had not expected to feel inside that house. That night, unable to sleep, I wandered down to the kitchen and found Damien already there, sitting at the counter with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, looking more tired than I had ever seen him. Trouble sleeping too? I asked, reaching for the flour out of habit. Always, he said. It comes with this life. I began measuring ingredients without thinking, the motions as natural to me as breathing, and he watched in silence as I worked. Do you ever regret it? I asked. All of this. The house, the guards, the version of yourself you have to be every single day. He considered the question longer than I expected. I regret that my father is dying believing I have built something worth admiring, he said finally. I regret that most of what he sees is performance. But I do not regret protecting the people who depend on me, even if the cost is never having a life that belongs entirely to myself. That is a lonely way to live, I said softly. It is the only way I know, he answered, and something in his voice made my chest ache in a way I did not expect and did not entirely welcome. I slid a small piece of warm bread across the counter to him, still steaming from the oven. Eat, I said. Even dangerous men need to remember what comfort tastes like. He took it, and for a moment, watching him eat something I had made with my own hands in the quiet of that enormous kitchen, I forgot entirely that this marriage was supposed to be fake. Later that night, lying awake in my new room facing the garden, I realized with a quiet kind of dread that the boundaries Damien had drawn on our very first meeting were beginning to blur, not because either of us had broken them deliberately, but because 6 months was proving to be a very long time to pretend at something that was starting to feel uncomfortably real. Somewhere down the hall, I heard his footsteps pause outside my door before continuing on toward his own room, and I lay there, wondering if he had felt the same pull that had kept me awake, or if I was simply imagining connections in a house built entirely on careful, deliberate lies. I did not yet know that our first true test as a couple was only days away, or that the world beyond those iron gates was already beginning to whisper questions about the marriage no one had expected from a man like Damien Voss. 3 hours before the dinner, Vivian stood behind me in front of a full-length mirror, adjusting the collar of a dress she had chosen herself, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "Listen to me carefully," she said, meeting my eyes in the reflection. "Callum Marchetti does not ask questions to gather information. He asks questions to watch how people react while answering them. It will not matter what you say tonight nearly as much as how steady your voice sounds while you say it." "I do not think my voice has stopped shaking since the invitation arrived," I admitted. "Then do not let it reach your face," she said, straightening my shoulders with both hands. "My brother has spent years building a reputation that keeps this family safe. Tonight, that reputation depends partly on you. I know that is unfair. I know none of this was ever supposed to become your responsibility. But it is, and I believe you can carry it." Her words surprised me more than any drilling on names or family history had managed over the previous days. "Why are you helping me now?" I asked. "You made it very clear on my first night here that you did not trust me." "I still do not fully trust you," she said honestly, "but I have watched my father laugh more in the last 2 weeks than he has in the last 2 years. And I have watched my brother come home from meetings and ask the kitchen staff whether you have eaten dinner yet, before he asks about anything else. Whatever this arrangement actually is underneath all its rules, it is doing something neither of us expected. I am not willing to let Callum Marchetti destroy that over dinner conversation." I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply nodded, grateful for an ally I had not expected to find inside that house. Downstairs, Damien waited by the car in a dark suit that made him look even more formidable than usual, his expression unreadable as always, though something in the way his eyes moved over me when I descended the staircase told me he was not entirely as composed as he appeared. "You look like someone who belongs at that table," he said quietly, offering his arm. "I feel like someone who is about to walk into a room full of people hoping I fail," I admitted. "Then let us disappoint them together," he said, and for the first time since the wedding, I felt something steady settle in my chest, a strange comfort in facing danger beside someone who seemed just as determined as I was not to lose. The moment we stepped through the Marchetti mansion doors, I felt 100 eyes measure me and find me wanting. Damien's hand rested against the small of my back, warm and steady, and I understood immediately that the gesture was as much for the watching room as it was for me. "Smile," he murmured near my ear. "They are already deciding whether to believe us." I smiled the way my mother used to smile at difficult customers, warm enough to disarm, careful enough to reveal nothing underneath it. Callum Marchetti met us at the base of a grand staircase, a silver-haired man whose politeness felt sharper than any weapon I had ever seen. "Damien," he said, extending a hand, "and this must be the wife everyone has been talking about." "Clara," I said, offering my hand before Damien could answer for me. "It is a pleasure to finally meet the man my husband speaks of so carefully." Something flickered across Callum's face, amusement mixed with calculation. "Carefully," he repeated. "That is one word for it." He led us into a dining room, glittering with crystal and quiet threats disguised as conversation. I was seated beside an older woman named Delphine, who spent the first 10 minutes testing me with questions, dressed up as small talk.
"How did you and Damien meet?"
she asked, swirling wine she had not yet tasted. "At a charity event neither of us particularly wanted to attend," I said smoothly, drawing on a story Vivian had drilled into me 3 nights earlier. He complained about the music, I complained about the food. We discovered we agreed on almost nothing, except wanting to leave early. Delphine laughed, genuine surprise crossing her face. That sounds remarkably real for an arrangement everyone assumed was invented overnight. Marriages built too carefully rarely survive their first argument, I said, holding her gaze. Ours survived several before the wedding even happened. Across the table, I caught Damien watching me, with an expression I had not seen from him before. Something between astonishment and pride, quickly hidden behind his usual composure. The evening rolled forward through courses I barely tasted. Every sentence I spoke measured twice before I let it leave my mouth. Then, halfway through dinner, Callum leaned back in his chair and asked the question I had been dreading since we arrived. "Tell me, Clara," he said. "Tell me something about my old friend that only a wife would know. Something private, something that would embarrass him if it were shared with this table." The room went quiet enough that I heard my own heartbeat. Damien's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and I understood in that instant that this was the true test, the moment everything either held together or shattered in front of the one man capable of destroying us both. I set down my fork slowly, buying myself half a second to think. "He hums when he thinks no one is listening," I said finally. "Terribly, off-key, always the same 3 notes from a song he refuses to name. I have never told him I have heard it, because I think it is the only moment of the day he allows himself to be completely unguarded, and I refuse to take that from him." Silence stretched across the table, and then Delphine laughed, a genuine bright sound that broke the tension like glass. Callum's eyes lingered on me a moment longer, searching for the crack in my story and finding none, because it had not entirely been a lie. I had heard him humming, once, in the kitchen, though I had never admitted it until that very second. Damien reached over and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine in front of everyone, and the warmth of it startled me more than I expected. "That is not something I share easily," he said quietly, looking at me rather than at Callum. I did not realize she had noticed. The moment passed, conversation moving on to safer subjects, but I felt the entire room recalibrate its opinion of us, felt the danger in the air thin just slightly, enough to breathe again. Later, near the end of the evening, Callum found me alone near the terrace doors, while Damien spoke with 2 men I did not recognize across the room. "You are good," he said quietly, no longer performing politeness for an audience. "Better than I expected. Either you love him, or you are the most convincing liar I have encountered in a very long time." "Perhaps it is not one or the other," I said carefully. "Perhaps it can be both, depending on the day." Callum studied me with something unreadable in his expression. "Be careful, Clara," he said finally. "Men like Damien do not survive by being loved. They survive by being feared. If you have found a way to give him both, you have made yourself a very interesting variable in a game that punishes interesting variables severely." "There is something else," Callum added, posing before he left entirely. "Delphine believes your story about the humming. Most of the table believed it as well. But I noticed something the rest of them did not." "What is that?" I asked, my pulse quickening despite my attempt to stay composed. "You did not look at Damien when you told the story," he said. "You looked down, at your own hands, the way people look when they are protecting a memory rather than performing one. Liars watch their audience for reaction. You were somewhere else entirely for those few seconds. That is a very specific kind of tell, Clara, and it is not one I often see from someone claiming a marriage of convenience." My throat tightened, unsure whether I had just been caught or quietly reassured. "Perhaps convenience and truth are not always opposites," I said carefully, echoing my earlier words back at him. "Perhaps not," he agreed, studying me a moment longer. "Or perhaps you have simply convinced yourself of something that started as a performance and is no longer entirely one. Either way, it makes you dangerous to men who prefer certainty. I would advise you to decide quickly which version of this marriage you actually intend to live inside, before someone else decides it for you." I did not know how to answer that, so I said nothing, and he walked away without waiting for a response, leaving me with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air drifting through the open terrace doors. The car ride home was quiet, both of us drained from hours of careful performance. Damien finally broke the silence somewhere past the city lights. "You saved us tonight," he said. "I want you to know that I understand what it cost you to invent something so personal on the spot." "I did not entirely invent it," I admitted, staring out the window rather than at him. "I have heard you hum. In the kitchen. Twice. When you thought I was already asleep upstairs." He went very still beside me. "You were listening," he said. Not quite a question. "I could not help it," I said. "The house is quiet at night, and sound travels strangely through those hallways." He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its usual careful control. "My mother used to hum that song," he said, "before she passed. I did not realize I still did it until you just told me you had heard it." I turned to look at him properly, struck by how rare it was to see him unguarded, even for a moment. "I am sorry," I said softly. "I did not mean to take something private from you and use it as material for a performance." "You did not take it," he said, meeting my eyes in the dim light of the car. "You protected it. There is a difference, and I am not certain anyone has ever done that for me before." Neither of us spoke again until the car passed through the iron gates, but something had shifted between us in that quiet exchange, something neither the wedding nor 6 months of careful arrangement had managed to create, until that single unplanned confession in a moving car. Inside the house, Elias was waiting up despite the late hour, seated in his wheelchair near the entrance with a look of quiet hope on his face. "How did it go?" he asked eagerly. "She handled Callum Marchetti better than most seasoned negotiators I have worked with in 20 years, Damien said, and I felt my chest warm at the pride evident in his voice. Elias smiled at me, tired but genuine. "I told you," he said to his son. "I told you, the moment I met her, that she was exactly what this family needed." Damien did not argue with him, though I noticed he did not fully agree either, his eyes finding mine across the room with an expression I could not entirely name. Later, alone in my room, I sat by the window overlooking the garden and replayed the entire evening, trying to separate the parts I had performed from the parts that had felt uncomfortably, undeniably true. The hand he had taken in front of the whole table, the quiet confession about his mother, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at me, briefly, as though I were something worth protecting, rather than something borrowed for 6 months. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts, and I opened the door to find Damien standing there, tie loosened, looking as tired and unguarded as he had in the car. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, away from an audience. "You already did," I said, "in the car." "I know," he said. "I wanted to do it again, without anyone watching, so you would know I meant it both times." We stood there in the doorway for a long moment, the silence between us charged with something neither of us had agreed to feel when this arrangement began. Then he stepped back, offering a small, tired smile that reached his eyes in a way I had not seen before that night. "Good night, Clara," he said softly, using my name rather than a title for the first time since the wedding. "Good night, Damien," I answered, and closed the door slowly, my heart beating faster than any performance in front of Callum Marchetti had managed to cause. I did not sleep easily that night, replaying every word, every glance, every moment where the line between our arrangement and something dangerously real had blurred beyond anything either of us had planned for when this began. The next morning, I found Vivian waiting in the kitchen before I had even finished tying my apron, a cup of coffee already poured for me, which she had never done before. "Delphine called me at 7, she said, sliding the cup across the counter. "She could not stop talking about you. Said you were the most convincing woman Callum has brought to that table in years, and not because of anything you said, but because of how unwilling you seemed to perform for people who did not deserve honesty from you. That is either the kindest thing anyone in this house has said to me, or the most dangerous," I said, wrapping my hands around the warm cup. "Possibly both," Vivian admitted. "Callum does not forget faces that unsettle him. You should assume he will be watching you long after last night's dinner has been forgotten by everyone else at that table." I thought of his final words to me on the terrace, the quiet accusation wrapped inside something that had almost sounded like concern, and felt a familiar unease settle low in my stomach. "He told me to decide which version of this marriage I actually intend to live inside," I admitted quietly, "before someone else decides it for me." Vivian studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "And have you decided?" she asked. "I do not know yet," I said honestly. I did not expect any of this to feel the way it is starting to feel. "Neither did my brother, apparently," she said, and there was no cruelty left in her voice when she said it, only something close to quiet worry for both of us. "That should frighten you more than anything Callum Marchetti said last night." I carried her words with me for the rest of that day, through every task in the kitchen, through every quiet moment I caught myself replaying the drive home, the confession about his mother, the softness in his eyes that no performance could have manufactured convincingly enough to fool someone as observant as Callum Marchetti had proven himself to be. I did not yet know that Callum's warning about interesting variables was not simply idle conversation, or that somewhere in the city, a decision was already being made about how to test the true strength of the marriage I had only ever agreed to fake. The morning had started so ordinarily that I almost forgot, for a few peaceful hours, what kind of life I had married into. I had opened the bakery before sunrise, the way I always did, kneading dough while the street outside slowly filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Ellery arrived at her usual hour, commenting on how much brighter I seemed lately, and I found myself smiling without having to force it, thinking of warm mornings in the sunroom with Elias, and quiet conversations in the kitchen with Damien that had started to feel less like performance and more like something I looked forward to every single day. By afternoon, the shop had emptied enough for me to finally sit down with a stack of receipts, and it was only when I stepped outside to lock up for the day that the unease began, faint at first, the kind of feeling that arrives in your shoulders before your mind can explain why. A black car followed me for 3 blocks before I let myself admit it was not a coincidence. I had left the bakery later than usual, arms full of receipts I needed to sort for the accountant Damien had insisted I hire, and the streets were quieter than the daytime crowd I was used to navigating. The car kept a careful distance, never close enough to be obvious, never far enough to be nothing. By the time I reached my apartment building, my hands were shaking too badly to find my keys. I did not go inside. Instead, I turned, forcing myself to face whoever had been trailing me, because running had never once solved a problem in my life. A man stepped out of the car, unhurried, dressed the way men dressed when they wanted you to notice how expensive their patience was. "Mrs. Voss," he said, though the name sounded like an insult in his mouth. "My employer would like a word." "I do not know your employer," I said, keeping my voice steadier than I felt. "You will," he said, gesturing toward the open car door. "Callum sends his regards, and a request for a private conversation. Nothing dramatic, simply a conversation." Everything in me screamed to refuse, but I understood enough about this world by now to know that refusing an invitation from a man like Callum Marchetti rarely ended the danger. It only delayed it. I stepped into the car. Callum was waiting inside, alone, his expression pleasant in a way that felt far more threatening than open hostility would have. "Thank you for coming," he said, as the car pulled away from my building. "I promise this will not take long." "What do you want?" I asked, refusing to let my voice waver. "Information," he said simply. "Damien has become careless lately, distracted by something I suspect is you. I want to know what he discusses in that house late at night, who visits, what shipments move through his territory, and when. Small details, nothing that would ever be traced back to you." I felt something cold settle over me, the full weight of what he was asking finally clear. "You want me to betray my husband," I said. "Your husband?" he repeated, amusement flickering across his face. An interesting choice of word for an arrangement everyone in this city knows was invented to solve a problem. "I am simply offering you a way to solve a new one, before it becomes dangerous for you personally." "I have nothing to tell you," I said, meeting his eyes directly despite the fear coiling tightly in my chest. "And even if I did, I would not." His pleasant expression did not change, which somehow frightened me more than anger would have. "That is unfortunate," he said. "Because I know about the bakery, Clara. I know about the neighborhood you grew up in, the elderly woman who visits every Tuesday, the small debts a few of your suppliers still carry, that could easily become large problems if the right pressure were applied. I would hate for good people to suffer because you decided loyalty mattered more than sense." Panic rose in my throat, sharp and immediate, but beneath it something harder took shape. something that refused to let this man see how deeply his threat had landed. "If you touch any of them," I said quietly, "you will learn exactly how much this arrangement has already changed the man you think you understand." Callum studied me for a long moment, something almost like respect crossing his features before it vanished behind calculation again. "Brave words," he said. "I hope, for your sake, they are not the last brave thing you ever say." "You mistake bravery for something simpler," I said, my voice steadier now that the initial shock had passed. "I have very little left to lose that you could take from me twice. My mother is already gone. My bakery survives because of choices I have already made. The only thing you can threaten now is people I love, and threatening the people I love has never once made me more cooperative. It has only ever made me more difficult to frighten." "Difficult to frighten is an expensive quality in this city," Callum said quietly, studying me as though recalculating something behind his composed expression. "Most people learn that lesson far too late." "Then it is fortunate I am learning it now, while I still have the chance to act on it," I answered, and for the first time since stepping into that car, I saw something flicker across his face that looked almost like uncertainty. The car stopped near my apartment, and the same man who had brought me let me out without another word. I stood on the sidewalk shaking long after the car disappeared around the corner, torn between fear for the people Callum had threatened and fear of what would happen if I told Damien the truth. In the end, there was no real choice at all. I went straight to the house. I found Damien in his study, and the moment he saw my face, he rose from his desk without a single question. "What happened?" he said, already moving toward me. "Callum Marchetti had me followed," I said, the words spilling out faster than I intended. "He threatened people I care about, the bakery, my suppliers, everyone who has nothing to do with any of this, unless I give him information about you." Something shifted in Damien's expression, a stillness far more dangerous than any anger I had witnessed in him before. "What did you tell him?" he asked quietly. "Nothing," I said. "I told him nothing, and I never will." He crossed the room and took my face gently between both hands, an intimacy that startled us both. "You should have called me the moment that car appeared," he said, his voice tight with something raw. "Not walked into it alone." "I did not have a phone with me," I said, "and I was not certain I was in danger, until I already was." He pulled me against him then, an embrace that had nothing performative about it, no audience to convince, no rules dictating the gesture. "I will handle this," he said against my hair. "I will make certain nothing happens to you or to anyone you care about. I swear it." "This is exactly what I was afraid of when I agreed to this," I said, my voice muffled against his chest. "I was supposed to be protected from your world, not pulled directly into its center." "You are not simply pulled into it anymore," he said, pulling back to meet my eyes. "You are part of it, Clara, whether either of us planned for that to happen or not, and I will not allow anyone to use that fact to hurt you." That night, the house filled with a tension I had not felt since my earliest days there. Guards moving with new urgency. Phone calls carried out in low, clipped voices behind closed doors. Vivian found me in the kitchen, unable to sleep, and sat across from me without her usual sharpness. "He has not looked this angry in years," she said quietly. "Not since our mother died." "I am sorry," I said. "I did not mean to bring this kind of danger into your family." "You did not bring it," Vivian said. "Callum has wanted an excuse to test my brother for a long time. You simply gave him the opening he was already looking for. What matters now is that my brother has made it very clear you are not a variable he intends to lose." I thought of Callum's words on the terrace after the dinner, his warning about deciding which version of this marriage I actually wanted to live inside. Sitting in that kitchen, listening to the low murmur of Damien's voice through the study door, as he made calls I could not fully understand, I realized the decision had already been made for me somewhere between a kneeling man in a courtyard and a warm cup of coffee shared with a dying man who had come to trust me completely. I no longer wanted 6 months. I wanted whatever came after them, regardless of how dangerous that choice might prove to be. Elias called for me before sunrise, his voice carried down the hallway by a nurse who looked apologetic for waking me. I found him sitting up in bed, weaker than I had seen him in weeks, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for mine. "Vivian told me what happened," he said, his grip surprisingly firm despite his frailty. I am sorry, Clara. I am sorry my family's enemies have made you a target for simply agreeing to help an old dying man see his son settled before the end. You have nothing to apologize for, I said gently, sitting on the edge of his bed. I made my choice, knowing this world came with risks. I do not regret it, not even tonight. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes clearer than his failing body suggested they should be. My son loves you, he said quietly. I have watched enough marriages in my lifetime to recognize the real ones from the performances, and whatever this began as, it is no longer a performance. Not on his side, and I suspect not on yours either. I did not answer immediately, unsure whether admitting the truth aloud, this early, and to this man, would make it too real to take back. I care about him more than I expected to, I finally admitted. More than either of us planned for when this started. Then do not let Callum Marchetti or anyone else convince either of you to walk away from that, Elias said, his voice fading with exhaustion but his conviction unwavering. Some things are worth more than the safety of pretending they do not exist. I stayed with him until he drifted back to sleep, his hand still loosely holding mine, and when I finally returned to the kitchen, the sky outside had begun to lighten with the first gray hints of dawn. Near dawn, Damien finally emerged from his study, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, though something in his posture told me the immediate threat had been handled, at least for the moment. It is done, he said, sitting heavily beside me at the counter. Callum will not touch your bakery or anyone connected to it. He understands now that doing so comes at a cost he is not prepared to pay. What did it cost you? I asked quietly. More than I want to explain tonight, he said, but nothing I would not pay again, without hesitation, if it meant keeping you safe. I reached for his hand across the counter, and he let me hold it. No performance required, no audience watching to judge whether the gesture looked convincing enough. We sat there together as the sky outside slowly lightened, two people who had entered an arrangement built entirely on convenient lies, and had somehow, without either of us fully noticing the moment it happened, built something between us that neither Callum Marchetti nor anyone else in this dangerous world could threaten into disappearing. I did not yet know that Elias's health was failing faster than either of us had been told, or that the choice waiting for both of us at the end of our 6 months would arrive far sooner, and far more urgently, than either of us had ever prepared for. The call came at 3 in the morning, and I knew from the sound of Damien's voice in the hallway that Elias did not have much time left. I dressed faster than I had ever dressed in my life, and found Damien outside his father's room, one hand braced against the wall, the composed man I had married nowhere in sight. He is asking for both of us, he said, his voice cracking in a way I had never heard from him before. We entered together, and Elias looked smaller in that bed than I had ever seen him, his breathing shallow, though his eyes found mine with the same warmth they always carried. There you are, he said weakly, reaching for my hand. I was worried you would not make it in time. I am here, I said, sitting close beside him. We both are. Elias turned his gaze to his son, and something passed between them that felt too private for me to witness, though neither man asked me to leave. I need you to promise me something, Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. Anything, Damien answered. Do not let this end when the 6 months do, Elias said, his eyes moving between us. I do not know exactly what began as arrangement and what became real, but I have spent enough years reading people to know love when it sits quietly in a room, waiting for two stubborn people to admit it exists. Do not let pride or fear or old habits convince either of you to walk away from something this rare. Damien's jaw tightened, emotion clearly fighting its way through years of careful control. I promise, he said finally, his voice rough. Elias smiled, satisfied, his grip on my hand loosening slightly. Good, he said, then I can rest easy. He passed quietly before sunrise, surrounded by the only two people he had asked to be there, and the house that had once felt so guarded and silent to me, suddenly felt achingly empty in his absence. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of arrangements and quiet grief. Vivian, who I expected to retreat behind her usual sharpness, instead leaned on me more than either of us anticipated, and somewhere in planning a funeral together, whatever distance had remained between us finally dissolved completely. He would have wanted flowers from your bakery, she said one afternoon, sitting across from me at the kitchen counter, her eyes red-rimmed but her voice steady. Not from some expensive florist downtown. From you. I will make sure every arrangement carries something I baked myself, I promised. And she nodded, grateful in a way she did not need words to express. The funeral itself passed in careful, guarded silence. Familiar faces from the Marchetti dinner, scattered among mourners who watched Damien as closely as they watched the casket being lowered. I stood beside him through all of it, my hand in his, no longer performing anything for anyone, simply present, because there was nowhere else I wanted to be. Afterward, in the quiet emptiness of the house, the reality of what came next settled over both of us. Our 6 months were nearly finished. The arrangement that had brought us together had technically fulfilled its purpose. Elias was gone, and with him, the reason we had told ourselves justified all of this. In the days after the funeral, I noticed how differently the house moved around its grief. Guards who had once nodded silently now paused to offer quiet condolences whenever I passed. The chef prepared Elias's favorite meals on what would have been his birthday, without anyone asking, simply because the entire household had come to love him the way I had. Even the iron gates seemed heavier somehow, as though the house itself understood it had lost the one person who had softened everything within its walls. I spent those quiet mornings alone in the sunroom, continuing our old ritual out of habit, more than anything else. Baking a small almond cake, I no longer had anyone to share it with. Vivian found me there one morning, tears in her eyes despite her usual composure, and sat across from me without a word, until I finally slid a plate toward her. "He loved you baking these for him," she said quietly, breaking off a piece with her fingers. "I used to resent how quickly he trusted you. Now I understand he simply recognized something the rest of us needed longer to see." "What was that?" I asked. "That you never once treated this family like a transaction, even when it began as one for you," she said. "Most people who marry into money learn to enjoy the money quickly. You never once stopped acting like someone who had walked into a stranger's house and decided, almost immediately, to actually care about the people inside it." I did not know how to answer that, so I simply reached across the counter and squeezed her hand, grateful for a friendship neither of us had expected to build when I first arrived, as a frightened stranger, wearing someone else's ring. I found Damien alone in the sunroom one evening, sitting in the chair his father used to occupy, staring out at the garden without really seeing it. "We need to talk about what happens next," I said quietly, sitting across from him in the chair that had become mine over the past months. "I know," he said, not looking away from the window. "The 6 months end in 11 days. "I am aware," I said, "and I do not know what you want that ending to look like." He finally turned to face me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw real uncertainty in his expression, none of the careful composure he wore for every other moment of his life. "I do not want it to end at all," he said. "I have known that for weeks, long before my father made me promise anything. I was simply too afraid of what admitting it out loud might cost either of us." My heart pounded loudly enough that I was certain he could hear it. "What are you afraid of exactly?" I asked. "That you agreed to 6 months and nothing more," he said. "That the danger this life brings, the threats, the men like Callum Marchetti who will never stop circling, are not something you should have to carry, simply because I could not bring myself to let you walk away when the arrangement ended." I reached across the space between our chairs and took his hand, the same way I had the night Callum threatened everyone I loved. "I did not fall into this slowly by accident," I said. "I chose it, every single day, long after I could have walked away and did not. I am not afraid of the danger that comes with loving you, Damien. I am only afraid of a version of this, where we pretend 6 months was ever really the limit of what either of us wanted." Something shifted in his face, relief and disbelief tangled together in an expression I would remember for the rest of my life. "Say it plainly," he said quietly. "I do not want to misunderstand something this important." "I love you," I said, the words arriving easier than I expected, as though they had been waiting patiently for permission to exist out loud. "Not the version of you performing for Callum Marchetti, and not the arrangement that saved my bakery. You, the man who hums off key when he thinks no one is listening, and who protected me the moment real danger arrived, without a single second of hesitation. He rose from his chair and crossed the small distance between us, kneeling in front of where I sat so our eyes met evenly. "I love you too," he said, the words carrying none of the careful control he usually wrapped around every sentence. "I have loved you since the dinner where you protected a memory of my mother without even knowing what it meant to me. I was simply too much of a coward to say it before tonight." Neither of us moved for a long moment, simply staring at each other with the full weight of everything unspoken, finally spoken aloud. "I do not want a marriage built on rules and rehearsed answers anymore," he said finally. "I want to ask you properly, the way I should have asked from the very beginning, if I had known then what I know now." "Ask me then," I said softly. He took my hand in both of his eyes steady, despite the emotion clearly moving beneath them. "Clara," he said, "will you stay, not because of debts I cleared or rules I wrote, but because you want the same life I am asking you to build with me, truly, and for as long as we both want it to last?" "Yes," I said, and the word felt entirely different from the one I had spoken in front of a stranger officiant months earlier. This time it belonged only to us. Vivian found us there an hour later, still sitting together in the fading evening light, and though she said nothing about what she clearly understood had happened, the small smile she gave me before quietly leaving the room told me everything I needed to know about how she felt about it. Word of our decision spread quickly through the careful world Damien moved within, and I braced myself for another confrontation with Callum Marchetti, certain he would see our choice as exactly the kind of interesting variable he had warned me about. Instead, when we crossed paths at a business gathering weeks later, he approached with something closer to respect than threat. "I suppose you have made your decision," he said, studying the way Damien's hand rested naturally against my back, no longer a performance for onlookers. "I have," I said simply. "Then I hope, for both your sakes, it proves less dangerous than these things usually do," he said, and though the words carried a warning, they no longer felt like a threat aimed directly at me. Life did not become simple after that. Damien's world remained exactly as dangerous as it had always been, filled with rivals and careful negotiations and threats that never fully disappeared. But I learned to navigate that world the way I had learned to navigate a demanding kitchen, with steady hands and quiet confidence, no longer a stranger playing a part, but a woman who had chosen this life fully and completely. My bakery flourished beyond anything I had imagined possible during those desperate nights before Damien first knocked on my door. With the debts long cleared and steady support behind me, I expanded into the building next door, hiring 2 of the neighborhood teenagers who had once studied quietly at my corner table, and adding a small sunroom in the back, where I baked almond cakes every single morning, in memory of a man who had seen the truth of my marriage, before either of us was brave enough to admit it ourselves. On quiet mornings, Damien would slip into that kitchen before the shop opened, stealing warm bread straight from the oven, the way he had that very first night we cooked together, humming softly under his breath without realizing I could hear him, the same 3 notes from a song that had once belonged only to a mother he missed, and now belonged to the family we were quietly building together. I never forgot the woman who had opened her door to a dangerous stranger, desperate and afraid, willing to trade 6 months of her life for a chance to save the one thing that still connected her to her mother. But standing in that expanded kitchen years later, watching Damien steal another piece of bread, with the same guilty smile he always wore, I understood that what began as a transaction between 2 strangers had become the truest, most unexpected thing either of us had ever built. A year after that quiet evening in the sunroom, we held a small gathering in the garden behind the house, nothing like the grand wedding that had first bound us together in front of strangers, who watched the doors more closely than the bride. This time, only people who genuinely mattered stood beside us. Vivian, radiant and unguarded in a way I had never seen before Elias passed. Mrs. Ellery from the bakery, seated proudly near the front, telling anyone who would listen that she had always known there was something real between us, long before either of us admitted it aloud. Even Delphine attended, though Callum sent his regards from a distance, a small gesture of respect that I understood, by then, was as close to warmth as a man like him allowed himself to offer. We exchanged no rehearsed rules that afternoon, no careful negotiations about what the marriage would or would not require of either of us. Instead, Standing beneath the same garden windows that had once glowed gold on the night I first arrived as a frightened stranger, we simply promised each other the truth, in whatever form it continued to take, for however long we were fortunate enough to share it. Afterward, in the quiet of the kitchen where our story had truly begun, Damien pulled me close and rested his forehead against mine, no audience left to convince, no performance required for anyone watching. 6 months, he murmured, a small smile finally breaking through the composure he wore for the rest of the world. That is what I offered you the night I knocked on your door. And instead you got a lifetime, I said, smiling against him. I would not trade it for anything less, he answered, and pulled me into a kiss that belonged only to us, unwitnessed and entirely real, the final proof that everything which began as a desperate arrangement between two strangers had become, quietly, and without either of us noticing exactly when, the truest thing either of us had ever built. Nobody, least of all either of us, had expected a fake marriage to become the realest thing in both our lives. But some of the best things, I had come to learn, arrived disguised as arrangements neither person ever intended to keep.